Professor Diego Bourbon is a researcher and professor at the Center for Studies on Genetics and Law at the Universidad Externado de Colombia.
So, why is neuroscience useful for the law? The law and the legal practices basically try to address, regulate, and limit human behavior. And we cannot address or regulate something we don't understand scientifically. That's why neuroscience is so valuable for the law, because it helps us to understand scientifically human behavior. So when we talk about neurolaw, we might also talk about three specific areas of application: revision, assessment, and intervention. Basically, revision is how neuroscience should help us revise the law and the legal practices. For example, what about free will, retribution, and punishment? It seems neuroscience tells us that we are not that free that we think we are. And perhaps those classic criminal law doctrines of retribution and punishment might be not really well addressed and encompassed with scientific evidence about how human behavior actually works. So for example, free will and the debate of free will might help us to revise the law and the legal practices. Also, for example, think about how we should regulate the advance of neurotechnology. So currently there's a really big debate in the global south and international legislations about neuro rights, which is basically perhaps the need that we might have to create new legislations, laws, and even new categories of human rights. But also in the revision, for example, take into account the prison use, mass incarceration in the US, for example, and prison overcrowding across Latin America. We should perhaps check our legal practices, as mass incarceration really don't show neither that we could reintegrate persons into society, nor that they produce any psychological well-being, as isolation and impoverished environments will actually decrease general well-being. Also take into account, for example, apart from revision, assessment. The law really cares about mental states. So what about risk assessment? What about their prediction of violence or recidivism that is taken into account in courts, for example? What about lie detection? You can learn to lie to a polygraph, but perhaps not to your own brain. What about mental disorders, and what should judges and courts take into account for punishment and retribution? And the final important and useful area of neurolaw is intervention, that perhaps in the future it's going to be more common that instead of criminal sentences and punishment, we might have especially consensual and interventions regarding rehabilitation, regarding, for example, psychotherapy, and in the most severe cases, perhaps also neurocorrections and interventions. So that's why the law is valuable, neuroscience is valuable for the law, because it helps us to understand scientifically human behavior.
Starting with you, Professor Bourbon, is one of the challenges of neurolaw is that the fields are different. I mean, lawyers don't generally know very much about neuroscience, but also neuroscientists don't know much about law. And how do you think this divide can be overcome? And I'd like to ask all the panelists, but I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So one of the biggest problems is that we as lawyers are not trained in neuroscience, and not even in many cases in psychology or how the human behavior works. So this is especially challenging in the global south and Latin America. Perhaps the comparison between the US use of neuroscience evidence in the courtrooms is especially interesting regarding, for example, Colombia. The US, the Supreme Court, as a research showed around 10 years ago led by Nita Farahani, almost 5 to 25% of Supreme Court cases regarding life sentence or death penalty uses neuroscience evidence to lower responsibility and punishment, for example. But in Colombia, the Supreme Court of Colombia, and I personally reviewed this, doesn't have a single decision or ruling regarding the use of neuroscience in the courtroom. So we don't really have legal standards nor Supreme Court decisions on how should neuroscience inform legal decisions. So this challenge in the Global South, we are trying to overcome it, especially starting to create academic associations, to educate, to capacitate. For example, in Buenos Aires, and here is Professor Aline Salles, she created Neuroética Buenos Aires, which is one of the first neuroethical associations here in Latin America. Then, for example, the Mexican Association of Neuroethics. And recently, in June, we created perhaps one of the biggest networks on it, and is the Ibero-American Network on Neurolaw and Neuroethics, which joins around 40 experts and universities of Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Uruguay, Spain, and Portugal, and Brazil. So we can start educating, teaching, researching, and publishing about how neuroscience should inform legal decisions. So yeah, that's one of the first and possible most biggest challenges of how to overcome this. And I think this panel in the Science Summit is basically a good step forward. Yes.
Professor Bourbon, you want to?
Very briefly, there are many challenges when introducing neuroscientific evidence in the courtroom. Perhaps, do they reflect on the intent or the mental states at the moment of the crime? Definitely not, because brain scans for criminal trials are made way long after the crime has been committed. So you cannot actually say that much about criminal intent or mental states at the moment of the action. But perhaps in those cases when there are severe structural, functional dysfunctions in the brain that you can actually see and measure, perhaps it might help you lower punishment or retribution. But in most of the cases, you have to be very careful on what extent are you overly relying on neuroscientific evidence. So definitely, for example, in Colombia, one of the most big challenges are financial challenges. So we don't usually do brain scans mainly for financial reasons. And in our forensic system, psychiatrists and forensic psychologists, well, they just use DSM-5 and other psychometric tools to address, for example, mental disorders or insanity defenses. And what Oliver actually says is, well, perhaps we should also think about neuroscience as a tool beyond just the courtroom, but also to think about social policy and public policies to prevent what's happening here, for example. Also, in the United States and in Colombia, we have mass incarceration. We have high rates of violence, and criminal law is not going to solve the problem. We might perhaps focus more, instead of punishing people, perhaps on prevention, rehabilitation, do social justice. And this is something we agree on. Also, for example, in international legislations, there's also a big problem regarding the political influences in these decisions. So, for example, in Latin America, most of our legislations have juvenile differentiated approximations when someone is younger than 18 years old. So, for example, here I have it. Brazil, Costa Rica, and Panama has a juvenile system since 12 years old. Colombia and, for example, Bolivia since they are 14 years old, and Argentina since they are 16. But the political challenge is also regarding, for example, what is happening currently in Argentina. They're having nowadays a really important congressional debate on whether if they should even punish juveniles as adults. So, for example, there are even bills that propose that even since you're 13 years old, you should be trialed as an adult. And that's a really big problem regarding on the political influence and the information that politics has on neuroscience. So definitely, for example, evidence suggests that relatively complete brain maturity is reached at the mid-20s. So this should inform policy making.
Mid-30s.
Sure, even mid-30s, yeah. So that's not really happening in practice. And that's what we, as scholars and researchers and judges, will need to try. For example, in Argentina it's happening. Many psychiatrists are going to congresses and saying to the politicians that neuroscientific evidence demonstrates that a 13-year-old kid should not be tried as an adult. And also just a brief comment on it, and it's your comments and your question actually leads me to, for example, research has shown that at least in the United States, there are 10 times more people with mental disorders in prisons than in hospitals and mental health care institutions in the United States. And that should inform not just neuroscience in the courtroom, but especially treating criminal law as a social problem and as a mental health care problem and a public health concern. Just some comments on your... That's a very interesting question and reflection. And the thing is, I don't know if you share this opinion, but at least it seems to me that the evidence suggests that what we are currently doing in the criminal justice system is not working. Is not working. All around the world where we do harsh criminal policies, where we always try to solve social problems with punishment, well, the immediate consequence is not a reduce of violence and crimes. It's actually the opposite. So the thing is, I do think that firstly, neuroscience should inform the discussion, but that this is also a scientific and a political decision to understand the needed changes to what is not working currently. Citizens all around the world are not satisfied with criminal justice systems. We need to go beyond it. So that's why I'm also thinking that criminal law is not the end of history. Criminal law justice systems cannot be the highest level of intelligence of human race, right? So we should really think about what comes next, what comes after criminal law. And I think neuroscience, but also sociology, public policy, healthcare, do inform the decisions to transcend punishment, retribution, and mass incarceration, which is currently not working, which should focus on prevention, social policy, and of course, mental health care.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly, 30 years ago, David Wexler, for example, was talking about therapeutic jurisprudence, which is basically to understand the law and the application of law as a therapeutic agent. And that doesn't start in punishments, in prisons. That starts to think how really human behavior works and how you can promote and foster better non-violent communities. So yeah, I do think there's hope, but I actually think it's important to take into account that this is a political decision. So we as, for example, you as a policymaker, as scientists, as scholars, we should foster the debate, we should communicate what the neuroscientific evidence is and also what social policy says. So I do think there's evidence, but it's also very difficult when in most of our countries we have harsh punitive practices. For example, in Colombia, they legislate in favor of prison sentences, where we didn't have that, and the Constitutional Court had to declare it unconstitutional. I think it's hope, but it's a political decision in which scientific evidence do play an important role in it.
Well, I just wanted to, how about a hand for our amazing panel? Thank you very much. It was incredible.